Wow, that was a long one, huh? I know. So I invite all of us to just leave this behind, this story from long ago, and to just arrive where we are. Some people are quite literally still arriving, so please find your space and join with us in gathering around this table. We're gathering at St. Rose of Lima in the year 2024, a significant year in this country, and it is a time that is so different from what Jesus would have experienced during his time walking this earth. What I see here is quite significantly different from many other masses that I go to, because we have a lot of little children here today. You notice that? This mass is probably the mass that has most of the little ones. And there's something amazing about little children that makes them very different from us. Yes, they're much shorter, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is the way that they relate to other people, especially children. They don't look who the other person is, who that other child might be, what their parents are, or what their background is socioeconomically or whatever. They just want to play. That makes them very different from us. In our day and age, we find ourselves in a world in which we can choose who we want to interact with. And many of those interactions, they happen not face-to-face, but more and more online, right? Social media. And we make a lot of friends online. And these friends are our friends because we notice that we share some interests with them, or maybe we share opinions with them, and then we avoid those people who don't. Oftentimes, it's even an artificial algorithm that's suggesting new friends to us, so we don't even have to look anymore. And in such a world, there is very little room for patient discussion with people who think differently or are differently. And so we may create circles in which we feel very comfortable. We avoid people who make us uncomfortable, those people we don't deem to be attractive, or who we think are too old, or too sick, or too strange, or too foreign. We shy away from those who might be boring, or those people who are poor, or simply those with whom we seem to have nothing in common. And as a result, we may find ourselves living in a tiny little bubble without learning anything new. But today, and now I take us back to our readings, today we are reminded this is not the Christian way to live. Jesus lived in a world without smartphones and computers. I think we all agree on that. That's pretty obvious. So maybe it was a little easier to meet all kinds of people because of that. In any way, the only way to meet people at that time was face to face. And in the Gospels, we see a world full of personal encounters, both positive. Think about how Jesus called his disciples, very positive encounters, but also negative. Think about all the trouble he had with the Pharisees always and again. At all times, not only today, not only during Jesus' time, but at all times throughout history, we are invited to a very special kind of encounter. God wants to meet us, and he wants to meet us in Jesus, in the warmest and the most personal ways, by taking our hand, touching our wounds, looking at us with love, and speaking words of encouragement. Jesus is a real expert of those kinds of face-to-face encounters. He wants those kinds of encounters for us, in which he is present, encounters that are a blessing and that make us deeper human beings. The healing presence of Jesus, it is an invitation for us to imitate the way that he interacts, encounters, and meets other people. In our first reading from the book of Wisdom, we hear very clearly that God did not make death, nor does God rejoice in the destruction of the living. God created all things that they might have life. And when we hear that, we're reminded of the first book of the Bible, Genesis, with its creation accounts in the beginning. God's intentions for us and for this world are always for life and for goodness. But do we see that? Do we see that in our world? In a world where death and suffering and division seem to be so dominant. And we're once again reminded today, when we listen closely and in silence, that these are all not from God. They are brought into the world by sin and evil. God's plan for us is to experience life in its fullness. There is no doubt about it. And this life includes relationships that take us beyond the borders of our comfort zone. In today's gospel, we see Jesus on his way to Jairus' house to call a little girl back to life, which we hear later on. He's surrounded by crowds, and that is very often the case, especially in the Gospel of Mark. We hear about those crowds. People don't seem to have any names or faces, but there are simply crowds. Many, many people, because of his growing reputation, want to meet this guy. And Jesus sometimes has to withdraw, has to go to a quiet place. And then suddenly he is surprised. He is surprised by a woman who does nothing else but touch his cloak ever so slightly. The woman's faith makes the healing possible, we are told. And Jesus, well, what does Jesus do? All he does is to tell her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you." The woman could have avoided the encounter with Jesus. In fact, she should have avoided the encounter with anybody. Her illness had made her impure in the eyes of society, but Jesus does not see her that way, does not reduce her to what makes her imperfect in the eyes of society. Jesus instead praises her for taking the initiative. She did not simply ask him to be healed, but she took action, seeking to touch him. She breaks a taboo, and so does Jesus in not rebuking her. Every human being is precious in the eyes of God, and Jesus rejects any form of discrimination. St. Paul, in our second reading, encouraged the Corinthians to excel in the grace of giving. Those were people who had the means to give. So he wants them to know that this is not just a choice, but it is a responsibility. Give of your blessings. He reminds them that Christ, though rich, became poor. He chose to become poor so that by his poverty we could become rich in life. This is a call to generosity and a call to compassion. Just as Jesus reached out to those on the margins, so too are we called to reach out to those in need, to share with them what we have, and to uplift others, which is in itself a life-giving action. Paul emphasizes that our abundance should supply the needs of others, creating a balance where everyone's needs can be met. This is a powerful reminder that our blessings are not just for us. They're not just for us. They're supposed to be handed on to benefit others as well. But do we as Christians really share in the healing power that is granted by Christ? Should we be healers for each other? I dare say yes, we should. It's a rhetorical question. Certainly, we should pray for the sick and for their healing. And Jesus may let his healing power and work through us. But oftentimes we're too timid. Maybe we're a little bit scared of other people. We're too timid to let others see our own need for healing and to help those who we can heal or who can be healed. And so we may miss many possible encounters with people who could teach us so many new things. The happiest encounters in the gospel are those in which a person responds to Jesus' healing power or wisdom with faith. To allow the healing power of Christ to reach us from others and flow through us to others, we too need to break taboos. We need to reach out boldly and touch those, especially those we fear to touch,